So, this HOA president literally kicked down my cabin door, right as I was having a beer with the state attorney general. She had no idea she'd just committed multiple crimes in front of the one person who could actually put her behind bars. I'm talking full-on wood splintering, designer heels crunching over broken glass, and the whole 9 yards. There she stood, dressed in a $1,000 blazer, wearing enough perfume to fumigate the county, storming into my grandfather's cabin like she owned the place. She started yelling about violations in jurisdiction, completely unaware of who she'd just barged in on, or that she was live-streaming her own downfall to over 3,000 people. 6 months earlier, I thought she was just another power-hungry neighbor with too much time on her hands. Turns out she was running a $4 million embezzlement scheme, and I was about to accidentally bring her entire operation crashing down. So, what would you do if an HOA tyrant invaded your private property during the most important meeting of your life? Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. I bet at least half of you have dealt with neighborhood dictators like this before. Anyway, let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. 6 months ago, life was pretty good. My name's Marcus Henley, 52 years old. After 3 decades of crawling through muddy trenches, installing power grids across 3 counties, I'd finally earned my retirement. My prize? My grandfather's old fishing cabin on Clearwater Lake. 2 acres of pure heaven that my granddad bought back in 1963 for just $800. Can you imagine? $800 for lakefront property that's now worth more than most homes. It wasn't some luxury mansion. It was better. Hand-hewn logs, a stone fireplace built by my granddad's own calloused hands, and a screened porch that creaked in all the right places. I kept it completely off-grid, solar panels humming softly on the roof, a well that drew the cleanest water you could taste, and a septic system that worked better than most city setups. Every morning, mist would rise off the lake just as the sun peeked over the pines, a reminder of why Pop chose this spot. He used to tell me, the land picks you, not the other way around. Smart man. He also said, Marcus, if someone wants your land real bad, find out why, because it's usually worth more than they're telling you. Then she showed up, Delilah Cromwell. Everyone just called her the HOA psycho. She rolled into our peaceful lake community like a tornado in designer clothing, 58 years old, fresh from some California subdivision where bossing people around was apparently a full-time career. She drove a pearl-white Escalade with vanity plates that said, Rule 1. I wish I was kidding. And she wore her HOA badge like a sheriff's star. Her mission, turn our quiet rustic lakefront into what she called an upscale resort community. At first, I didn't think much of it. But within 2 months of her arrival, 3 elderly couples had already sold their cabins to mysterious buyers. Funny coincidence, right? Her first move came on a Tuesday morning. I was on the porch sipping coffee and watching a pair of loons teach their chicks to dive when I heard that sharp clicking sound on my dock. Designer heels. At 7 a.m. on my private property. 10 minutes later, she was taping an official-looking notice to my screen door. Violation citation, unsightly dock structure damaging community property values. Fine. $500 compliance required within 72 hours or daily penalties would apply. I had to read it twice. My dock, the same one my grandfather and I rebuilt when I was 12, was apparently a threat to the neighborhood's property values. Trying to be reasonable, I walked over to explain that my cabin actually predated the HOA by about 40 years. She looked me straight in the eye, hands on her hips, and said, Everyone on this lake answers to me, sweetheart. Ask the Hendersons how fighting me worked out for them. The Hendersons, my elderly neighbors, had mysteriously decided to downsize just a month earlier after 23 years here. That cold feeling in my stomach told me something wasn't right. Then she started circling my cabin, taking photos of everything, my solar panels, my garden, even my grandfather's hand-carved porch railings. The smell of her air freshener drifting from her idling Escalade made my stomach turn. By the end of the week, I had 3 more citations, each with bigger fines and harsher language. It was clear. Delilah Cromwell had declared war on everything my family had built here. At first, I thought she was just another overbearing neighbor with too much authority. I had no idea I'd stepped into something far bigger and far darker than neighborhood politics. Pop's words echoed in my head. Find out why they want your land. I was about to find out, and it would change Everything 3 days after my compliance. Deadline passed, because I sure wasn't tearing down Pop's dock for some wannabe dictator. I got a certified letter that made my coffee taste like ash. Cease and desist. Violation of community waterway regulations. The letterhead read Blackstone, Meyer and Associates, one of those law firms that probably charged more per hour than I made in a month. The letter claimed my dock was illegally extending into community water and demanded over $3,000 in back penalties. They even threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 10 days. At first I panicked. They had lawyers. I had a toolbox and a bad temper. But then I remembered something Pop always said during our fishing trips. When someone tries to use fancy legal talk to take your land, the truth's always buried in the county records. So I drove down to the courthouse in that old dusty basement where real history hides. Betty, the clerk, still remembered my grandfather from his fishing days. She helped me dig up the original property surveys. What I found made my blood boil. My grandfather's deed didn't stop at the shoreline. It extended 50 feet into the lake. The documents were stamped and sealed from 1963. That meant my dock wasn't on community property at all. It was sitting squarely inside my legal boundary. And here's the kicker. The HOA wasn't even established until 1998, 35 years after Pop bought the land. In other words, they had zero jurisdiction over me. Feeling pretty proud, I drove back to the cabin. That confidence lasted until I tried to head to town for groceries and found Delilah's Escalade parked sideways across my driveway. Not beside it. Not near it. Blocking it completely like she was conducting a one-woman traffic stop. I tapped on her window. She rolled it down an inch and smiled. "Oh, Marcus," she said sweetly. "I'm just reviewing the community parking regulations. This might take a while." Her idling engine hummed while that same cloying perfume filled the air. I stood there trapped on my own property, wondering how a grown man who'd built half the county's electrical infrastructure could be held hostage by a suburban bully with a clipboard. But Delilah was just getting started. Within a week, she'd formed something called the Lakeside Beautification Committee, which sounded nice until you realized it was basically a task force to target anyone who didn't fit her country club vision. Neighbors who used to wave started crossing the street to avoid me. Her social media posts were masterclasses in passive-aggressive manipulation, concerned about certain eyesores hurting property values. Some people just don't care about community pride. The comment section turned into a feeding frenzy. People I'd known for decades suddenly acted like real estate lawyers, repeating her talking points like gospel. 3 of my neighbors even apologized to me privately. They knew something was wrong. Tom and Susan Martinez finally pulled me aside during one of my evening walks. They looked nervous, glancing over their shoulders like someone might be listening. "Marcus," Tom whispered, "Karen told us to file complaints against your property or she'd start hitting us with citations too." He went on to explain that she'd already targeted old Mr. Peterson over non-regulation window boxes and threatened the young couple with the baby about their unsafe playset. "She's got something on everyone," Tom said quietly, scanning the trees as if Karen might pop out with a camera. "And her husband works up at the state capitol. He's connected." That landed like a cold slap. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. This woman had reached far beyond our little lake community. That night, I found my mailbox covered in bright orange spray paint. Huge letters spelling out "comply or leave." My hidden solar-powered security camera caught everything, including Karen's license plate as she drove away at 2:30 a.m. I called the sheriff's office the next morning. Guess who showed up? Deputy Chad Cromwell and Karen's nephew. He glanced at the vandalism report, shrugged, and said, "Probably just kids. You know how it is." The rough texture of that paint under my fingers as I tried to scrub it off felt like sandpaper on my soul. Pop used to say, "Sometimes you need bigger guns for a bigger fight." Time to find some bigger guns. Karen's next move came dressed up as civic duty, which somehow made it even worse. She'd figured out that direct confrontation wasn't working, so she decided to weaponize the county bureaucracy against me. It started with a polite knock at my door from Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a guy I'd actually worked with for years. The apologetic look on his face told me everything before he even opened his mouth. Marcus, I'm real sorry about this, but I've got a complaint about unpermitted structures on your property. You know I have to follow up. 3 hours later, Dale had crawled through every inch of my cabin with his clipboard and tape measure. His verdict? Everything was not only up to code, but actually exceeded current safety standards. Pop built things to last. As he packed up, Dale muttered, "Whoever filed this either doesn't know what they're talking about, or they're just trying to waste everyone's time." The next day, it was Environmental Officer Janet Bennett, checking reports that my septic system was contaminating the lake. She admitted it was one of the best installations she'd ever inspected. Then Fire Marshal Bob Rodriguez showed up to examine my solar panels for hazardous wiring. Clean bill of health there, too. Each false inspection cost me a day of peace and chipped away at my retirement sanity. Worse, each bogus complaint was building a paper trail that made me look like some kind of problem property owner. My old union rep used to warn us about this tactic. Bureaucratic harassment looks legitimate on paper even when it's pure malice. While I was juggling inspectors, Karen was working her media game. She landed a spot on Channel 7's Community Spotlight, positioning herself as a selfless citizen fighting to protect our family-friendly lake environment. The news segment was a masterclass in selective editing. She showed carefully angled shots that made my cabin look like a rundown shack, talked about dangerous conditions threatening children's safety, and painted herself as a brave advocate standing up to irresponsible property owners. What really got my blood boiling was watching her deliver this performance. While standing on my dock, the same dock she'd called illegal, as if it were her stage, my phone buzzed with angry texts from neighbors who'd seen the broadcast. Half the lake community now believed I was some kind of environmental menace. But this time, Karen overplayed her hand. My old friend Jake Martinez from the Electricians Union called me after watching the news story. "Marcus, that lady's full of it and everyone knows it. You build half the clean energy infrastructure in this county. Your solar setup is the one I use as an example when I train apprentices." Within 2 days, Jake had organized a parade of my former coworkers to drive by and publicly inspect my property. Turns out having 20 master electricians vouch for your work tends to shut down the hazardous installation narrative pretty fast. That's when things started getting interesting. My lawyer buddy, Chuck Davis, we'd gone to high school together, stopped by for a beer and dropped something that made my ears perk up. "You know, Marcus, the Attorney General's office has been investigating HOA corruption cases across the state. Several communities reporting the exact harassment patterns you're describing." "What kind of patterns?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. Elderly homeowners getting hit with frivolous citations, property values driven down on purpose, mysterious buyers swooping in with cash offers. Ring any bells? It rang every bell I had. Chuck explained these schemes usually involved someone with political connections providing cover, while harassment campaigns drove out longtime residents. The properties would then get flipped to developers for massive profits. "The AG's office is looking for witnesses," Chuck continued. "People who've documented the harassment and can prove the pattern. Someone like you might be exactly what they need." The mechanical hum of my refrigerator seemed unusually loud as that information sank in. Karen wasn't just some power-drunk neighbor. She was part of something bigger and more systematic. That night I started a detailed log of every interaction, citation, and inspection. I also began researching Karen's background. Turns out her husband, Robert Cromwell, wasn't just a minor state employee. He was the state party treasurer, a position that gave him access to development plans, zoning changes, and political favors across multiple counties. The smell of fresh coffee mixing with the morning lake air usually calmed me down. Now it just reminded me how much I had to lose. This wasn't about HOA fees anymore. This was about whether I'd be the next victim in someone else's get-rich-quick scheme. Karen's next phase made everything before look like a friendly disagreement. She'd apparently decided bureaucratic harassment wasn't moving fast enough, so she shifted to full-scale character assassination. It started with a Facebook post that made my stomach drop. "Urgent safety concerns. Aggressive behavior from lakefront resident. Please keep your children away from the Eastern Shore area. Filing for protective measures. Lakeside safety ties protect our kids. Aggressive behavior? Me, the guy who'd organized the kids' fishing derby for 15 years. Within hours, that post had been shared 43 times. The comments turned into a digital mob of strangers convinced I was some kind of dangerous lunatic. All thanks to Karen's carefully crafted victim narrative. I always thought something was off about that man, one wrote. Heard he threatened an HOA board member. Every word was a lie, but it was working. Thank God for people like Delilah who were brave enough to stand up for me. But what really sickened me was realizing that half those online comments came from profiles with generic stock photos, the kind of fake accounts political operatives use to pump out lies. Karen wasn't just spreading rumors. She was running a full-scale professional smear campaign. 2 days later, she filed for a restraining order. Her petition, now a public record, painted me as an unstable man making verbal threats against community leaders. Total fiction. It didn't matter. The filing alone became proof I was dangerous. Judge Patricia Hriss, who had known my family for years, took one look at Karen's so-called evidence and dismissed the request for lack of credible documentation. But the damage was done. Now there was an official court document with my name and the word threats on it. The emotional toll was starting to eat me alive. I'd sit on Pop's porch in the evenings, nursing a beer and wondering if this fight was worth destroying the peaceful retirement I'd worked 30 years to build. Even his old leather recliner felt different. Less like comfort, more like the weight of a legacy someone was trying to erase. Just as I was thinking of giving up, something beautiful happened. The community started fighting back. Judge Hendricks wasn't the only one who remembered my family. Retired Judge William Bill Carter, who used to fish with Pop back in the 70s, showed up at my door with a thermos of coffee and some unsolicited legal advice. Marcus, that woman's playing a game your grandfather would have seen right through, he said. She's counting on you feeling isolated and overwhelmed. Don't give her that satisfaction. Bill explained that harassment campaigns like this usually signaled something bigger. People don't go to this much trouble over petty neighborhood disputes, he said. There's money involved. Big money. The local VFW Post, where I'd been a member for 20 years, issued a statement calling Karen's accusations baseless attacks on a decorated community member. The Historical Society weighed in too, highlighting my cabin's cultural significance as one of the last original lakefront structures. Even the environmental group that monitored water quality praised my sustainable living model. It felt like the decent part of our community was finally rallying around me. The bitter taste of stress was giving way to something that felt like hope. But Karen wasn't done. Not even close. Her next move was diabolical in its simplicity. She convinced the utility company to investigate irregularities in my electrical service. For 3 days, I had no power while they reviewed my solar grid connection for safety violations. Then came the false police reports. Suspicious activity at my cabin during broad daylight. Loud noises suggesting a domestic disturbance when I was clearly alone. Even possible drug activity, based on the unusual number of visitors. Visitors who were just my union buddies stopping by to show support. Each call brought sheriff's deputies to my door. Each visit created another incident report. Each report added to the growing file that made me look like a problematic resident. The most infuriating part was that Deputy Chad Cromwell, Karen's nephew, was usually the responding officer. He'd show up, ask a few perfunctory questions, and leave with a smirk that said he knew exactly what his aunt was doing. During one particularly surreal visit, he actually said, "You know, Mr. Henley, if you just apologized to my aunt and brought your property into compliance, all these problems would probably go away." That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen was showing other property owners what happened when you refused to bend the knee. The Hendersons, that elderly couple who'd mysteriously sold their home, probably went through this same nightmare. The ping of my phone became a source of anxiety instead of connection. Every notification could be another neighbor turning against me, another false report, another twist in Karen's psychological warfare campaign. But it also brought messages of support from people I'd forgotten even knew me. The fight was far from over, but I was finally learning the rules of the game. The breakthrough came during the most boring task imaginable, organizing paperwork for my upcoming meeting with the Attorney General's office. Chuck had arranged it, explaining they needed detailed documentation for their statewide HOA corruption investigation. I was sitting at Pop's old oak table, surrounded by stacks of citations, inspection reports, and legal threats when something caught my eye. One of Karen's violation notices had a tiny footer I'd never noticed before. Fines payable to Lakeside Estates Community Improve. Fund, account number 847291. Community Improvement Fund. It sounded official enough, but something about it nagged at me. Maybe it was 30 years of reading electrical contracts and spotting the fine print contractors use to rip people off. Either way, I decided to dig deeper. The county clerk's office had practically become my second home by then, so Betty knew exactly what I was looking for when I asked about HOA financial records. She pulled up the public filings and spread them across the counter like she was dealing cards. "Here's the thing, Marcus," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Homeowner associations have to file annual reports just like any other organization. Let me show you what I found." The numbers didn't add up, not even close. Over the past 2 years, the HOA had collected $280,000 in emergency assessments for lake dock repairs that were never completed. Another $150,000 had supposedly gone to landscaping, services provided by Cromwell Grounds, and maintenance, which state business records showed was owned by Karen's brother-in-law. But here was the kicker. The landscaping company had been incorporated exactly 3 weeks after Karen became HOA president. I remembered Pop's advice about following the money trail. When someone creates a business right after getting power, they're usually creating it to funnel money to themselves. The insurance claims were even more blatant. The HOA had filed for storm damage reimbursement 3 times in 18 months. But I'd lived through every storm on this lake, and none of them caused the kind of damage that would justify $95,000 in payouts. Betty helped me cross-reference the claims with actual weather reports from the National Weather Service. The dates didn't match. The HOA was claiming storm damage on days when the weather had been perfectly clear. "Marcus," Betty whispered, even though we were alone in the records room, "this looks like fraud, plain and simple fraud." My hands shook as I photocopied everything. The smooth feel of those pages felt like holding evidence that could change everything. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was organized theft from the entire lake community. The property management fees were the final piece of the puzzle. The HOA was paying $5,000 a month to something called Clearwater Property Solutions for administrative services. But when I looked up the business registration, the listed address was a P.O. box in the same postal district where Karen lived. Everything clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. Karen's harassment campaign wasn't just about power or personal spite. She was systematically driving down property values to enable a development scheme while simultaneously embezzling from the community fund. The elderly couples who'd sold their cabins hadn't just been harassed into leaving. They'd been forced to sell at below market prices because Karen's artificial property value concerns had scared off legitimate buyers. Those mysterious cash buyers were probably connected to the same development group benefiting from the embezzled funds. I thought about the Hendersons, probably counting pennies in some cramped apartment, never knowing they'd been robbed twice, once when they sold their dream home for peanuts, and again through the fees they'd paid into Karen's slush fund. The taste of black coffee had never been so bitter. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. Karen had been stealing from everyone, including the neighbors she'd convinced to turn against me. Pop always said that when you find corruption, it's usually bigger than you think. He was right. Karen wasn't just running an HOA. She was running a criminal enterprise, and I was about to hand the evidence to the one person in the state who could shut it down permanently. That night, I transformed Pop's back bedroom into something that looked like a police investigation unit. Maps of the lake property spread across the walls, showing original boundaries versus current HOA claims. The walls of my study were now covered in timeline charts, tracking every step of Karen's harassment campaign alongside suspicious financial transactions, photos, recordings, and documents sorted by potential criminal charges. I felt like one of those TV detectives, except instead of chasing dangerous fugitives, I was uncovering small-town corruption. The Attorney General's office had assigned 2 prosecutors to my case, Sarah Mitchell and David Bennett, and the moment they arrived, I could tell they meant business. Sarah was sharp-eyed, mid-40s, with the no-nonsense confidence of a safety inspector who never missed a thing. David, younger and quieter, carried the calm intensity of someone who'd already put plenty of white-collar offenders behind bars. "Mr. Henley," Sarah said, spreading out a stack of financial records across Pop's old dining table. What you've uncovered here goes far beyond HOA harassment. This is organized fraud that could affect dozens of families. David opened his tablet and started mapping out connections I hadn't even seen. We've been investigating similar schemes in 4 other counties, he explained. The pattern's identical, politically. Connected individuals using HOA positions to manipulate property values while funneling money into their own accounts. That's when they mentioned the FBI agent. Rebecca Torres from the White Collar Crime Unit had been tracking development. Fraud across the region, and apparently, my documentation was the missing link, tying multiple investigations together. The thing about financial crimes, Agent Torres said during our video call, is that they always leave a trail. Your HOA's records show classic red flags. Phony invoices, shell companies, misused insurance claims. But we need more than paperwork. We need witnesses and live evidence of ongoing activity. Meanwhile, my lawyer friend Chuck had been busy connecting with 17 other lakefront families who'd experienced similar harassment. When we all met at the VFW hall, the stories that came out made my blood boil. The Thompsons had been fined over $8,000 in made-up violations before being pressured to sell their cabin for 30% under market value. The Garcias had been charged $12,000 in emergency assessments for lake repairs that never happened. And poor Mrs. Patterson, terrified by Karen's constant legal threats, had abandoned her home of 43 years to move in with her daughter in Florida. Every story followed the same playbook: escalating threats, fake violations, pressure to sell, and every family had unknowingly paid into the so-called Community Improvement Fund, which turned out to be Karen's personal slush fund. Retired accountant Frank Weber volunteered to review the financials. Most people don't realize, he said, that homeowner associations must file annual Form 1120 tax returns if they meet certain income thresholds. Honest HOAs do this every year. Crooked ones don't, because proper accounting would expose their theft. Frank discovered that our HOA hadn't filed a tax return in over 2 years. Despite collecting hundreds of thousands in fees and assessments, that single detail could lead to federal tax evasion charges. The meeting that followed felt more like a military briefing than a legal strategy session. We had evidence, financial records, witness statements, audio proof, but Agent Torres wanted something stronger. She wanted Karen caught in the act. The best way to make this case unbreakable, she explained, is to capture her behavior in real time. We need her to incriminate herself on camera. That's when Chuck came up with the perfect plan. The Attorney General's about to announce new HOA reform legislation, he said. What if she makes the announcement at your cabin? It's symbolic, protecting homeowners' rights right where they were violated. Sarah's eyes lit up. If Karen's pattern holds, she won't be able to resist interfering. Her need for control will override her common sense. We spent the next week preparing for what Agent Torres called a controlled confrontation. Hidden cameras were installed throughout my cabin. Undercover officers took up positions around the lake. Multiple agencies coordinated for rapid response. Our local coalition had grown too. Neighbors, news reporters, and social media advocates ready to counter any false stories Karen might try to spread. My old union training kicked in. Plan for every possibility, double-check every safety system, and always have backups. By the end, we had backup plans for our backups. The trap was set. Karen's behavior had become so predictable that we could practically script her next move. All we had to do was wait for her to walk right into it. But she must have felt the pressure closing in, because her harassment quickly turned into outright sabotage. It was like watching a cornered animal, panicked, reckless, and dangerous. The first sign came when my solar panels mysteriously failed one Tuesday morning. I woke to dead batteries and flashing error codes. My electrician friend Jake came out to inspect and immediately spotted deliberate tampering. Wires loosened just enough to disrupt the system without obvious damage. Marcus, this is professional-level sabotage, Jake said, snapping photos of the damage. Whoever did this knows what they're doing. They wanted to cause chaos without leaving fingerprints. But Jake was smarter than Karen expected. After the first incident, he'd installed a hidden camera near the electrical panel. 2 nights later, it caught her in the act, creeping across my property at 3 a.m., screwdriver and wire cutters in hand. The footage was crystal clear. Karen Cromwell, HOA president and so-called community leader, vandalizing private property in the dark. The acrid smell of her cigarette still hung in the morning air, mixing with the pine scent that usually brought me peace. Then came my boat dock. I returned from town one afternoon to find my boat drifting halfway across the lake. The heavy-duty chains I'd used to secure it had been cleanly cut with bolt cutters. That boat, Pop's pride and joy, a 1978 base boat that still ran like a dream, was now scratched and beaten from hitting the rocks. It felt personal, like she'd defaced a piece of my father's memory. But Karen's biggest mistake came next. My septic system, recently inspected and fully functional, suddenly backed up. The stench was unbearable, thick with chemicals that burned your eyes. When the emergency technician arrived, he found evidence of industrial drain cleaner poured into the system, killing the bacteria that kept it running. This was no accident, he said, holding up contaminated soil samples. This was deliberate. The technician looked up from the ruined system, shaking his head. Someone pumped commercial-grade acid into your tank, he said. This isn't random vandalism. It takes real knowledge and real money to pull this off. The repair alone cost $3,200, but the damage went far beyond that. The lab report confirmed it. This was deliberate sabotage, the kind that required insider expertise in septic systems. While I was knee-deep in that mess, Karen was waging a full-blown media war. Anonymous accounts suddenly flooded social media with claims that my property was violating safety codes and threatening the neighborhood. It would have been funny if it weren't so malicious. Dozens of brand-new profiles posting identical comments within minutes of each other. Then came the intimidation. Deputy Chad Cromwell's patrol car began circling my cabin like a shark. 4, sometimes 5 times a day, he'd slow down just enough to make sure I saw him watching. Occasionally, he'd park in my driveway for 20 minutes, running plates on anyone who came by. Next, the building inspector discovered violations in projects that had passed inspection only weeks earlier. The fire marshal received anonymous tips about non-existent fire hazards. Environmental Services got bogus complaints about illegal dumping, on land they'd already cleared. It was bureaucratic warfare, death by 1,000 paper cuts. Every day brought new letters, new fines, new accusations. It was designed to drain my wallet, my patience, and my will to fight. But Karen wasn't satisfied targeting me alone. She started going after anyone who dared to stand by my side. Jake, my electrician buddy, suddenly had his contractor's license under review for safety issues. Bill Carter, the retired judge who'd offered me legal guidance, got slapped with a complaint to the state bar for unauthorized legal advice. The local VFW hall, the same one where we'd held community meetings, was hit with a surprise fire inspection that threatened to shut down their bingo nights. Even the Historical Society got zoning complaints about their downtown office. It was clear. Karen's message was simple: help Marcus Henley, and you'll be next. The stress was relentless. Each morning brought a fresh crisis, another letter, another bogus report, another wave of harassment. The metallic taste of constant anxiety became as familiar as my morning coffee. But what Karen didn't realize was that every one of her desperate moves was being logged and documented. Law enforcement was quietly building a rock-solid case. Her reckless behavior was creating the very evidence we needed. Agent Torres called it textbook escalation. When corrupt individuals feel the walls closing in, they start making mistakes, big ones. And Karen was proving her right, one sabotaged solar panel at a time. Then came her boldest move yet, one so outrageous it almost worked. Through her husband's political contacts, Karen discovered I wasn't just meeting with some minor state official. I was scheduled to meet with the Attorney General herself, Patricia Williamson. Instead of backing down, Karen decided to flip the script. Her plan was darkly clever. She'd pose as a victim of political persecution, claiming the state's top prosecutor was targeting her family for partisan reasons. If she could record herself confronting corrupt officials at my cabin, she could twist the narrative and cast herself as a heroic whistleblower, exposing government abuse. The first sign of her new strategy appeared online. She'd reached out to Government Accountability Watch, one of those watchdog blogs that thrives on stories of government overreach. Her headline: Small-town HOA president targeted by big government retaliation. Within hours, the story was everywhere. painting me as some kind of deep state operative working with crooked prosecutors to destroy an innocent family. The comments were full of outrage from strangers who'd never heard of our lake, yet were convinced Karen was a martyr for political justice. She'd tapped into that familiar undercurrent of distrust in small-town America and weaponized it perfectly. But her masterpiece was yet to come. Karen had set up a live stream. Her plan was to crash my meeting with the Attorney General, broadcast the confrontation in real time, and use it as proof of her supposed persecution. What she didn't know was that Agent Torres had already secured warrants for her phone and social media accounts weeks earlier. We knew everything: the bloggers she'd contacted, the script she'd written for her spontaneous confrontation, even the hashtags she planned to use. During our final coordination meeting, Agent Torres grinned. "This is perfect," she said. "She's going to confess to multiple crimes on live video. We couldn't have planned it better ourselves." The irony was poetic. Karen thought she was setting a trap for us, but in truth, she was walking straight into the most thoroughly documented arrest in HOA history. Her allies were abandoning ship too. The other board members distanced themselves once the financial records came out. Her husband was now facing his own ethics probe, and even Deputy Chad had been reassigned after Internal Affairs started asking questions, but Karen was too far gone to see any of it. The pressure of hiding years of fraud had pushed her over the edge. She'd become paranoid, calling neighbors at odd hours, accusing them of spying, leaving threatening messages for anyone who supported me. The night before the Attorney General's visit, she called 4 different families, warning them of consequences if they kept working with the government. Every single call was recorded by law enforcement. Each one added another count to her growing list of charges. That evening, I sat on Pop's porch watching the sunset stain the lake in gold and crimson. The loons called across the water, their echoes haunting and calm all at once. Tomorrow would decide everything, whether I could finally live in peace or spend the rest of my retirement in court battles. The cabin felt different that night, not just because of the hidden cameras and microphones, but because it had become a symbol of something larger. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was about proving that no one, not even the well-connected, could bully an entire community without consequences. Opened Pop's old leather Bible and read the verse he'd marked years ago, the story of David and Goliath. In the margin he'd written, "Sometimes the little guy wins because he's fighting for something bigger than himself." Morning came quietly. Karen would storm through that door soon, thinking she was about to expose corruption, never realizing she was about to expose herself. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling. Law enforcement was ready. And as I sipped my coffee, the taste of anticipation had never been sweeter. When Attorney General Patricia Williamson arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, she wasn't the stern political heavyweight I'd imagined. She was grounded calm, like the high school principal you could never lie to. Tough but fair, with sharp eyes that saw everything. She carried a thermos of coffee in one hand and a briefcase in the other, one that held the evidence that would finally end this nightmare once and for all. "Mr. Henley," she said, settling into Pop's old recliner like she'd been there 100 times. "Your documentation has helped us build criminal cases against HOA corruption rings in 6 counties. What you've uncovered isn't just local fraud, it's part of a statewide network of organized theft." We were deep in conversation about the charges when we heard it, the unmistakable roar of Karen's Escalade tearing up my driveway. Gravel sprayed everywhere like she was reenacting a high-speed chase. Car doors slammed. Multiple voices shouted directions about camera angles and sound levels. Karen had brought her entire social media crew for what she thought would be her grand moment of triumph. "Here we go," Agent Torres whispered into her earpiece from her hidden spot behind my woodshed. Attorney General Williamson didn't even flinch. She kept calmly taking notes as Karen's voice grew louder, winding herself into righteous fury for her live audience. "This is it, folks," Karen's voice carried through the window. "We're about to expose the corruption that's been targeting our family. The state's attorney general is illegally meeting with our harasser." The sharp click of her designer heels on my porch sounded like a countdown clock, but it was counting down to her disaster, not mine. Crash. The door burst open like she'd kicked it with all her might. Wood splinters flew. The Attorney General's coffee mug hit the floor and shattered. Perfect punctuation for what came next. Karen stormed in, phone raised high, still streaming live, completely oblivious that she'd just committed trespassing, breaking and entering, and assault, all in front of the state's top prosecutor. I demand to know why the Attorney General is secretly meeting with this man. She screamed, waving her phone like a weapon. This is government harassment. I have rights. The look on her face when Attorney General Williamson stood, flashed her official credentials and calmly said, Mrs. Cromwell, I am the Attorney General of this state, was priceless. Karen froze. Her expression caught live on camera for thousands to see. You've just committed multiple felonies in my presence, Williamson continued evenly. And your entire performance is being recorded by both my office and your own live broadcast. Karen's stream kept rolling as the realization hit. Her followers watched in real time as their self-proclaimed hero unraveled. The comment section exploded with disbelief, her audience realizing they'd been backing a fraud who'd just outed herself on camera. I'm in charge here, Karen stammered, still clinging to the illusion that her HOA title gave her authority over state officials. That's when Agent Torres stepped into the doorway, flanked by 2 federal officers. Mrs. Cromwell, she said, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, and criminal harassment. And thanks to your live stream, we have your confession, witnessed by about 3,000 viewers. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through my cabin like the closing of a book. Karen's phone slipped from her hand, still streaming the end of her downfall to a stunned audience. Karen, I said, standing from Pop's couch with a satisfied smile. Meet the Attorney General. She's been wanting to discuss your bookkeeping methods. Neighbors, who'd gathered outside, watched in. Silence as the woman who'd terrorized our community for months was read. Her rights right in my living room. Mrs. Patterson, who'd come down just for this moment, had tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived just in time for the walk of shame. Karen stumbled past the same dock she'd tried to have demolished, past the solar panels she'd called unsafe, past the cabin she'd labeled an eyesore. The pearl-white Escalade with its Rule 1 vanity plates was towed away as evidence. Her live stream ended with her voice echoing across the lake. This isn't over. My husband will fix this. You don't know who you're dealing with. Actually, Karen, we knew exactly who we were dealing with. A criminal. And criminals go to prison. Watching her sentencing 3 months later felt like Christmas morning. Federal Judge Michael Harrison didn't just throw the book at her. He launched the entire law library. 3 years in federal prison, $340,000 in restitution to defrauded homeowners, and a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board in the country. Her husband, Robert, wasn't far behind. Investigators discovered he'd been abusing his political connections to share insider zoning information. He resigned in disgrace and got 18 months for conspiracy and abuse of office. The HOA was dissolved almost overnight. In its place, we created the Clearwater Lake Volunteer Association. No dues, no citations, no power trips. Just neighbors working together to keep our lake beautiful. My role in exposing the scheme earned me something I never expected: whistleblower compensation from the recovered funds. That $45,000 check felt like justice for every sleepless night Karen had caused, but the real victory came afterward. Attorney General Williamson used our case to help pass new state legislation, the Henley Act, requiring annual financial audits for all HOAs and criminal penalties for harassment-based property scams. 3 other counties used our evidence to prosecute similar rings. Turns out Karen's network stretched across 5 states. Families who'd been forced out finally returned home. The Hendersons rebuilt their cabin. Mrs. Patterson moved back from Florida and threw a block party that lasted until sunrise. Property values soared. Peace had returned to Clearwater Lake. My once targeted cabin became a model for sustainable living, part of the state's renewable energy showcase. I even started Pop's Legacy Scholarship, offering trade school grants for local kids. Pop always said an honest life starts with honest work, and this felt like the perfect tribute. Our annual Clearwater Lake Festival now raises money for veterans housing. Last year, we funded 3 tiny homes for homeless vets. Laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue replaced the chaos Karen once brought. And in the quiet evenings, I sit on Pop's porch, watching the sun melt into the lake, gold and purple on calm water. No more letters, No more inspections. No more heels clicking on my dock. Just the rhythm of waves and the peace of knowing that sometimes when you stand your ground, David really can beat Goliath. The documentary crew finished filming last month. For hell, How One Man Took Down a Criminal Empire premieres next spring on Netflix. They even paid me enough to build a guest cabin for victims fighting their own HOA battles, because Karen wasn't one of a kind. There are power-hungry HOA bullies across America, but now there's a roadmap for fighting back. So what's your story? Drop a comment about your own HOA nightmare. You're not alone. These stories deserve to be heard. Hit subscribe if you believe in standing up to corruption, because next week, I'm sharing how a city councilman tried to shut down a veteran's food truck until some unexpected friends from the Pentagon stopped by. Thanks for watching HOA Stories, where the Karens of the world finally meet their match.